must stay. So back, I think it was in the 1980s, the National Council of Churches decided it would be a really good idea if every church, or nearly every church, because they knew churches being a contentious and objectionable lot, would not all sign on to the idea. But it would be a good idea if every church used the same readings every Sunday, at least those that wanted to. And so they came up with something called the Revised Common Lectionary, and prior to that point, there were other lectionaries. The Roman Catholics had their lectionary, the Episcopalians had their lectionary, the Lutherans had their lectionary, and the problem was they were kind of sort of the same, but not exactly. And the Roman Catholics said, no, we're not going to use your lectionary, but that was okay because they stole most of the ideas from them. Anyway, I know when they went to lunch, while they were doing this, and they went to lunch each year somewhere between Christmas and Easter. Because things repeat in there. Like, you get the baptism of Jesus a couple times in there. You get the transfiguration a couple times in there. And not in the Roman one, but in the Revised Common Lectionary. And so, for me, as somebody who has almost always talked about scriptures that were chosen from the Revised Common Lectionary, this has always been a problem. Because I can be absolutely brilliant once a year on just about anything. But twice in 2 months is asking a bit much. And so today's reading was actually the one we were supposed to use on February 1st, when it snowed a lot and most of you people weenied out. Meryl and I were here holding down the fort.
Al was here.
Al was here.
No, I was sick.
You were sick, a likely story. So anyway, we still have this period of these repeats, and I wanted to talk about this reading so much that I just moved it to today. Even though we were going to originally do it at the beginning of the month, we didn't. I think it's an important topic. Last week, when Aaron and I weenied out, because our car was broken down, we like the story. We were supposed to talk about the Transfiguration, which is the 5th Sunday of Epiphany in the Revised Common Lectionary, and comes up again next week if we wanted to, but I didn't want to. Because I thought I was talking about it yesterday, or last week rather. So, but I think it kind of sets up what we're talking about today, so I just want to say one quick thing about the Transfiguration, where Jesus goes up on the mountain, and any time in the Bible you go up on a mountain, you're going up to hear from God, whether you know it or not. And so they go up, he goes up the mountain, he takes Peter and John with him, right? Peter, James, and John, takes 3 of them. He's standing there, they doze off, they wake up, and there he stands with Moses and Elijah. Jesus does. And Moses and Elijah represent, in Jewish thought, the law, Moses, and the prophets, which is another way of saying, for them, the whole shooting match of Old Testament, the Old Testament. The scriptures they had. Never mind, there were the writings too, we don't want to talk about that. And Peter says, hey, this is great, because it's right about the time of something called the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to build a dwelling, and you all can hang out with us. And it's Peter getting it wrong again, is what we've traditionally thought. And then the next thing they know, God's voice comes and says, Peter, you're an idiot. Moses and Elijah disappear, and just Jesus is left. And God says, this is my son. And up until this year, I would have told it just like that Peter screwed it up. But this year it's occurred to me that Peter didn't really screw it up at all. And what happened on that mountaintop wasn't necessarily a physical appearance of Moses and Elijah, but rather a mystical experience that they had. So Peter, James, and John doze off. They essentially have a dream that involves a vision. And Peter does what we all want to do when we have this quaking religious experience. Right? He wants to hold on to it. He wants to capture it. He wants to grab it. He wants to hug it and squeeze it and kiss it and treat it nice so that it won't go away. but they always go away. That's the nature of mystical experience. So Peter gets it wrong, but for a very common human reason. It's such a beautiful experience. It's this moment of seeing clearly. You might even say, if you were from another tradition, that it was a Satori experience or a Kensho experience or a mini awakening. And they see what's going on, and like so many mystical experiences, they try to grab hold of it, they can't grab hold of it, and as we'll see in the weeks coming up, they lose the whole thing. We wake up, we see the truth, and it goes away, and we tend to do the same crazy stuff again until we have enough of those experiences that it gets through our thick skulls. And that's true of all of us. It takes repetition. So now, holding that in mind, the bit from OxfordBibliographies.com, and why it was on that website, I don't know, about the demons and the fact that Buddhism sort of looks at demons as being favorable forces. Christianity actually did that too. If you ever look up, if you go by Mr. Paul's Episcopal Church, which is downtown,
Mr. Paul?
well, it's Mr. Paul's because it's such a low church. They'd rather you not use the word saint.
All saints.
Well, yes.
Yes.
Of course,
I used to be the secretary there, so I can tell you. Quite that low.
the Vatican is a low church compared to All Saints. That's like the old joke about why does the Anglo-Catholic not go back to Rome? And it's about, he doesn't want to give up being Catholic, in his proposal. And deflates, but that's another story. So Mr. Paul's has gargoyles on the building.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And other churches do too, but that's the one that comes to mind for me locally. And so if you think about Christian history used kind of some scary looking characters, if you will. You might even say demons. Not that Christianity would, but other traditions would say, well, that's a demon. And the demon's up there to scare away the dangerous forces. Yes, ma'am? Shark?
Has gargoyles.
Do they have gargoyles
Yeah.
too? I think a lot of it was
Lot of
it
them.
Gothic? I don't know what,
Yeah.
I'm not an architecture person.
It's Gothic era.
Got
The National Episcopal Cathedral also.
I've never been there actually. So it was really quite common at one period in history for Christianity to use scary looking beings to scare away even scarier beings. So it's not unique to Buddhism, but Buddhism doesn't necessarily see the demonic, what we would call the demonic, as a negative thing. They see it as just a force that can sometimes be used to protect loyal Buddhists. And in some temples, in some Tibetan temples, the faces of these beings are veiled because they're supposedly so scary that if we saw them, we'd be overwhelmed and run away. But the demons, apparently, the other demons, the nasty forces, can see through the veils, see the protective deity, demonic deities under there, and they run away. So demons are not necessarily bad things in the history of religion. Different traditions have viewed them differently at different times in history. And so Jesus comes across this fellow who seems to be, in the consciousness of the time, possessed by a demon. And the people who are 21st century historical Jesus types say, and there's nothing wrong with being one of those. I don't believe I am one of those, but there's nothing wrong with being one of those. I understand. They say, no. This was mental illness. Or this was some other kind of illness. This wasn't really a demon possession because we don't believe in demons. And so sometimes you can read the descriptions of Jesus encountering people who are possessed by demons and say, well, there's one in particular that's a pretty good description of what an epileptic is.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to say, yeah, okay, this guy he encountered was epileptic. But there's others that aren't so clear. And then there's a really confusing story about a herd of pigs, but we won't get into that. But what if it's neither? What if we try and look at this in the same way I was just describing the transfiguration? In that it isn't so much a case of people being right and wrong, but something being encountered. And so I'll tell you about a funeral we were at yesterday.
Oh, boy.
You know, sometimes you go to a funeral, not so much the funeral service part, but the show and tell period, as I like to call it. And you see the people that are there, and you see a pretty high level of dysfunction. And you see, for example, if you're ever at a wake and there's a lot of people carrying cans or bottles of Sprite,
Yeah.
they aren't drinking soda water. I mean, they might be, but that's not all that's in the bottle. Especially when every can or bottle is, well, Sprite. Nobody seems to have a taste for a nice Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, especially a Pepsi, right? And so, when you're at one of those kind of wakes, and you get the sense that if there were to be a spark, the room could very well explode because of the high alcohol content in the air. Or if it's not that, it's another substance, or it's both. In common language, we might say that we have a group of people that are struggling with their demons. I mean, it's real common language, and sometimes, in the course of my life, I said, well, that's unfortunate. We really shouldn't talk about it that way. But if the demonic is more than just a little guy in red pajamas with a tail and a pitchfork, and other people that work for him and wear similar outfits, if the demonic instead are forces within our life that we struggle with, now we get out of some of those images that maybe stretch us beyond where we're willing to go contemporarily. You know, maybe it isn't somebody being possessed by Satan. You know, maybe it isn't, when we hear about that case here in Milwaukee, within the last 5 or 10 years, about,
That kid got killed?
yeah, the teenage girl that got suffocated by her pastor, who was laying on top of her trying to drive demons out of her, and unfortunately he weighed a lot more than she did and she couldn't breathe. If we can get away from that kind of imagery, you know, that you have something that I need to expel from you. If you have something that you need to expel, please let me know and I'll move away, you know?
The air in your lungs.
Yes, and that's a demon of another sort. But what if Jesus encounters these people who are really struggling internally? And they're struggling with their demons in contemporary metaphor. And I just read an article a couple weeks ago about addiction, just as one example, that said that addiction arises primarily out of a great, it's more than a dissatisfaction, but a life situation that people just cannot process. And so they seek to anesthetize it. My belief when I worked mental health was that there was no such thing as an addicted person who didn't have a mental health diagnosis underneath it, that they just hadn't found yet. I think we go to addiction when we try to medicate the things that we just can't get a grip on. And pretty soon, the medication gets a grip on us as well. What helps you overcome that? Not wanting to discount the medical component in that. When we're struggling with our demons and can't get away from them, I believe the thing that helps us overcome that is love and unconditional acceptance. I also believe that's the only thing that will help us overcome and see through a life circumstance that is absolutely so unsatisfactory that it drives us to a place where it seems like we need to search for some resolution of that almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so now that encounter of Jesus with these people who are struggling is one of love and acceptance. It doesn't involve hosing them down with holy water, throwing himself on top of them until they can't breathe anymore, formal rites of exorcism. Not that maybe there's a time and a place for that. But I think for most people, life is so dramatically different than I believed it should have been or ought to be or that other people experience that I just can't cope. And what can possibly in that circumstance make life palatable? Love and acceptance. Transformative love and acceptance that's unconditional. That doesn't say, well, if you do this, you'll be all right. But just says, look, you're okay just the way you are. And whatever has happened, no matter how tragic, no matter how contrary to the way it should have been, whatever has happened doesn't change the fact that you are, in essence, more than okay, more than acceptable, because you bear God within you. And I believe these people encounter Jesus and do a Jewish namaste. You know, the holy within them recognizes the holy within Jesus. And in that, a transformation occurs that I can't explain, but maybe is an awful lot like being on top of the mountain and everybody's in shimmery white clothes all of a sudden. You know, it is that mystical transformation that defies words, defies explanation, that we can't reproduce and command, but that when it happens, changes our lives forever. Whether we're profoundly wounded or less profoundly wounded. Because woundedness, like physical pain, like emotional pain, there isn't really a hierarchy of its impact. Pain is pain. Woundedness is woundedness. We struggle just the same. Whether somebody would stand outside and say, well, you were sort of wounded, you were moderately wounded, you were profoundly wounded. The truth is, the struggle is the same. And I think, well, I know for me, that makes miracle stories come alive. Because it isn't hocus pocus. It isn't, you know, can I pray the right prayer and just the right words and not screw any of them up and not leave one out or it won't work? Can I lay on you until you either throw me off or die? Or anything like that. It's a much more profound yet simple encounter that comes from the essence. Comes from within both the healer and the healed. And not some sort of lightning or magic that comes from outside. And yet, it's much more powerful than any magic could